July 25, 2004, Lancashire, England. Brian Blackwell, considered the perfect son, commits one of the worst crimes in the Liverpool region. His victims are his own parents, who, while they rot in the family home, Brian goes on a kind of honeymoon with his girlfriend. The details of this sordid story you will know now. What's up, guys? How are you doing? In this video, I'm going to talk about the Brian Blackwell case. Sydney and Jacqueline Blackwell were a typical British couple who met in the late 60s. The two were already divorced from previous marriages, and after a few years of relationship, Jacqueline became pregnant. She gave birth to a boy in 1986, whom the couple named Brian Blackwell. After the birth of Brian, who was the only child they had together, the couple decided to move to Lancashire, a suburb close to Liverpool in England. Brian had a normal childhood and grew up in a peaceful home. As he grew up, Brian was described by family and friends as intelligent, educated, and dedicated to his studies. Both his parents, friends, and some close relatives saw him as a model boy, an example to be followed. Brian's grades at Liverpool High School were the best. The boy had the dream of becoming a doctor, something that was encouraged by his teachers who saw great potential in him. Everything was going very well for Brian and his family, but some disagreements between him and his parents would cause things to go wrong and get out of control. Due to his exceptional grades, Brian was accepted to Edinburgh and Nottingham universities to study medicine. His parents, however, wanted him to study at the University of Edinburgh. It is said that Brian's parents, especially Jacqueline, his mother, put a lot of pressure on him to the point of making almost all the choices that were supposed to be his, for him. This kind of messed with the boy's head, and as time passed, he became mentally unstable. His mental instability caused him to create an imaginary world in his head with the intention of escaping reality. In this imaginary world, he was a professional and famous tennis player, full of fans, sponsors, and of course money. While this fantasy only stayed in his imagination, we can say that everything was relatively going well in Brian's life. However, when this fantasy was brought by him into a real world, things started to get complicated. Brian began to create very elaborate lies in which he told his colleagues that he was a professional tennis player and had a certain fame abroad. Brian actually played tennis at school, and he was good at the sport, being, for a long time, the captain of the school team, but of course his level was not equal to that of a professional athlete. Due to Brian being an exemplary student and having a good record, many of his classmates believed him, but there was a minority who were suspicious of the claims that he was a professional and famous tennis player outside the country. Brian lied so well that it seemed like he believed his own lies. One day, he went to a sporting goods store and asked to speak to the person in charge there. When the person in charge arrived, a manager, Brian introduced himself saying he was a professional and famous tennis player, the same story he told his colleagues. He told the manager that he was looking for sponsorship and that in return he could promote the store's brand at his games. The manager, without really understanding what was going on there, told Brian that it was fine, but that the only type of sponsorship he could grant was a good discount on all products in the store if Brian was interested in purchasing something. It wasn't what Brian expected to hear. In his head, he was going to get some money, but he accepted this kind of sponsorship without question. After all, this was better than nothing. As time passed, Brian's falsehoods were increasing, both in number and in level of sophistication, if we can use that term. He began informing his colleagues that he had finalized an agreement with Nike and that it would generate a substantial amount of money for him. He also said that he had already made several international trips to participate in tournaments and that he always gave interviews to sports magazines. In the midst of all this, Brian's heart began to beat faster for a girl named Amal Saba. Amal was 17 years old at the time, like Brian. She was also studying at Liverpool College, and it was there that they met in 2001. Even though they met in 2001, they didn't plan to date. They just wanted to be friends. But as time went by, this friendship grew and they became closer and closer. So after 3 years of friendship, Brian asked Amal to be his girlfriend, and the girl accepted. The same lies he told his colleagues about being a famous tennis player and everything, Brian told his girlfriend. So much so that to shield his lies, Brian made a point of paying for everything every time he went out with Amal, and also showering her with expensive gifts, especially jewelry. He did this to impress Amal and also show how rich and successful he was due to his career as a professional tennis player. The girl's mother, seeing her appear at home with several expensive gifts, obviously found it all very strange and exaggerated. The woman began demanding from her daughter every invoice or receipt for all the gifts to make sure they were not stolen and could cause problems later. But none of these gifts were stolen, and you may be wondering, where did Brian get the money to buy all these expensive gifts? Well, he took the money from a savings account that his parents had set up to pay for any costs he had with the college he was going to start the following year. And of course, he took this money without his parents' knowledge. As I had said before, a minority of his colleagues did not believe Brian and began to demand more concrete evidence from him regarding his allegations. But at that point, Brian no longer cared about proving anything to anyone, as most of his colleagues believed in him, and so did his girlfriend. As time passed, Brian, excited about it all, began to make promises to his girlfriend. He told her she could be his manager and help him manage his career for a monthly payment of $2,000. He even gave her a check for $39,000, which Amal later discovered had no funds. Brian also promised his girlfriend that he would give her an apartment in an upper-middle-class neighborhood where several famous people owned properties. He even said that he had an apartment in that neighborhood valued at $450,000, but that he didn't go there often. Even though deep down Amal found her boyfriend's stories very strange, she didn't suspect it and believed him. One day the couple went to a luxury car exhibition, and at that event Brian pointed to one of the vehicles, a Mercedes valued at more than £60,000, and told his girlfriend that he had one like it. But as he did not yet have a driver's license, he left it in storage. That same day, Amal said that she would soon also need a car, as she was going to get her license. Upon hearing this from his girlfriend, Brian saw a new opportunity to impress her, and days later, he surprised her. Brian showed up with a vehicle in front of his girlfriend's house, and as soon as she left, he gave her the keys and said it was a gift for her. As you may have already imagined, at this point, the money in Brian's savings account was running out. Brian, more than anyone, knew this, and he knew that without money he could no longer support his lies, and everyone around him would be aware of the entire charade he created. With that, Brian started thinking about how to get more money, and one of the ways he found was to apply for 13 credit cards in his father's name. He also went to a bank where he said he needed a loan to go play in the French Open tennis tournament, also known as Roland Garros. On his loan application, Brian wrote that after the tournament he would repay the loan out of his $45,000 a year salary. Needless to say, the bank manager was suspicious of this whole story, and as Brian was too young and also gave no guarantee that he would pay back the loan later, the money was not released. By this time, Brian's parents had already discovered everything he was up to. This happened after he bought the car for his girlfriend, something that didn't go unnoticed by Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell. Consequently, the couple got in touch with the bank and terminated all the accounts and cards that Brian had the ability to use. It is said that the couple was disappointed. This was something they never expected from the perfect son they had. Now, Brian knew it was only a matter of time before his colleagues and also his girlfriend discovered the whole truth about him. Even so, Brian continued with his fantasy, so much so that he told his girlfriend that he would need to be absent from school for 3 days due to a tennis championship he was going to participate in Milan, Italy. Despite initially promising his girlfriend that she could accompany him, at the last minute Brian gave the excuse that he did not have permission from the sponsor to bring companions. However, in order to make up for it, he said he would take her with him to another championship which would take place the following summer, this time in Florida, in the United States. Brian's lies had already gotten out of control, and he knew that it was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain them, and that this would result in a brutal crime. On July 25, 2004, Brian and his father were seen at the tennis club they frequented. That same day, Brian secretly took one of his father's cards and purchased 2 plane tickets, spending around €5,800. The destination of these tickets was the city of New York in the United States, where he would go for a walk with his girlfriend and even pretend that he was going to participate in that tournament in Florida that he mentioned to her. However, Brian's father discovered that he had used his credit card in secret and confronted him about it. Brian reportedly told his father it was a trip for his girlfriend and that it wasn't a big deal. The boy's mother, who was also there and was aware of everything, expressed concern about the situation and, together with his father, said that he would not travel to the United States with his girlfriend. Brian got furious and told his parents that he had been planning this trip for 8 weeks and that they wouldn't mess it up. Brian then waited for his parents to become distracted and overcome with anger, picked up a hammer and went at them. He delivered a blow to each one's head, which was enough to knock them down. Then Brian took a knife and with his father on the floor, he struck him more than 30 times. Sidney, who was 71 years old at the time, couldn't resist and passed away right there. With his father already dead, Brian went to his mother and with the same knife, he stabbed her 20 times. Jacqueline, who was 60 years old at the time, also couldn't resist and died at the scene. After committing the crimes, Brian took off all his clothes and burned them. Afterwards, he took a shower, changed his clothes, packed his bags, and called a taxi. Brian asked the taxi driver to drop him off at his girlfriend's house. This same taxi driver later gave a statement to the police, in which he said that he did not notice anything unusual about Brian. Quite the contrary, the boy was very calm. The next day, Brian took a flight with his girlfriend to Miami. Then they went to Barbados, and then to San Francisco, California. Brian's girlfriend had no idea that he had taken her parents' lives and took all their cards with the intention of blowing as much money as he could. In the United States, Brian made sure that he and his girlfriend could enjoy the best that money could buy. They stayed in the best hotels, ate in the best restaurants, and even bought clothes in the best and most expensive stores. After spending a few days in San Francisco, Brian and Amal decided to go to New York. There, they stayed at the Plaza Hotel, a luxury hotel in which they chose the presidential suite, where usually only celebrities and high-ranking politicians stayed. The hotel bills that remained included very expensive meals, such as oysters, caviar, lobster, and the best champagne available. In addition to all this, Amal was encouraged by Brian to shop in expensive stores such as Prada or Gucci without worrying about spending. During this entire trip, Brian showed no remorse or strange behavior. In all the footage he took and all the photos he took, you can see an apparently happy and carefree Brian. The days went by, and Amal realized that the day of the supposed tennis tournament that Brian said he would participate in Florida never arrived. She asked him about it, and he told her that the tournament had been canceled due to weather conditions, but that she didn't need to worry, as it would be rescheduled. So that his girlfriend would not suspect anything about the crime, Brian pretended to speak to his parents several times during the trip. On August 12, 2004, the couple returned to England. When Brian got home, he was surprised. Everything was calm. Nobody had yet discovered what he had done. As his parents' bodies were there for days, the smell in the house was unbearable, and because of that, Brian didn't want to stay there. When leaving the house, a neighbor saw him and asked him where his parents were, as he hadn't seen them for days. Brian told this neighbor that his parents had gone to Spain for a holiday and that they were supposed to be back in a few days. With this same story, Brian went to his girlfriend's house and said the same thing to her mother. He also said that he was locked out of the house because his parents forgot to leave him a key. Brian then asked his girlfriend's mother if he could stay at her house until his parents got back in a few days. The woman, without suspecting anything, allowed him to stay. During the time he stayed at his girlfriend's house, Brian went to her house several times to get clothes or anything else he needed. This, obviously, without his girlfriend and her mother knowing, since for them, he didn't have the key to the property. Brian was seen several times at the location by his neighbors, including one of those times he was seen playing tennis in the backyard of his house, completely carefree. He even approached two people, according to some sources, homeless people, and offered them money in exchange for them to burn down his house. Both people refused Brian's criminal proposal. On September 5, 2004, a neighbor of the Blackwells who saw that the letters were piling up in the mailbox decided to be kind enough to pick them up and store them in a safe place. It was at that moment, as he approached the front of the house, that he smelled a very strong and horrible smell. Curious and determined to discover the origin of the odor, the neighbor approached the main window at the front of the house and looked through a crack. He saw almost the entire window covered with flies and larvae from the inside. There he realized that something was very wrong and decided to call the police. When the police arrived, they had to break down the main door of the house to enter the place. Once inside the property, the agents came across a scene from a horror movie, and it was almost impossible to stay inside the house for a long time due to the bad smell. As the bodies were already in an advanced state of decomposition, officers were initially unable to determine a certain cause, but they believed that Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell had been victims of gunshots. The police's first theory was that Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell had been victims of a burglar. However, when they checked the entire property, they saw that nothing of value had been taken. In conversations with neighbors, the police discovered that the couple's son, Brian, had gone to the property numerous times to pick up some things, and when asked about his parents, he said that they were on vacation in Spain. Upon hearing this, the police began to suspect the boy, as the date he was in the house and the advanced state of decomposition of the bodies showed that Brian knew that his parents were dead and still did not inform anyone. From then on, Brian Blackwell became the prime suspect in the crime. The very next day, Brian was located and detained at his girlfriend's house. Ma and her mother were extremely frightened by the entire situation, but they trusted Brian's claim of innocence. While in custody, Brian provided the police with a total of 7 statements. Firstly, Brian insisted that those couldn't be his parents as they were on holiday in Spain. He insisted on this, pretending to be in shock. As if faced with such terrible news, he entered a state of denial. Brian said he got in touch with his school and discovered that his parents didn't show up for his school grades. Something that he found very strange and made him quite sad, as he thought they were mad at him for some reason. He also said that he contacted the airline where his parents bought their tickets to Spain, and they informed him that Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell had taken a flight on September 7th. Until now, Brian's allegations were consistent, so much so that the police initially began to believe him, but in his subsequent statements he began to contradict himself, and that was when the authorities began to suspect him. With these suspicions, the police decided to search the house of Amal, Brian's girlfriend. There, they found a backpack belonging to him, and inside it was a hammer with blood on it, one of the weapons used in the crime, as well as the keys to Brian's house that he said he didn't have. Now, with this evidence in hand, the police officers confronted Brian, who, out of options, confessed to the entire crime but claimed self-defense. In his version, Brian said he was holding a hammer to hang a picture on the wall, and that was when, for no apparent reason, his father got up from the sofa and went to hit him. So, to defend himself, Brian hit his father with the hammer, causing him to fall to the ground. At that same moment, his mother appeared and witnessed everything and angrily went at him. And again, Brian used the hammer to protect himself, defend by hitting it too. It's obvious that the police didn't believe this story. They already had the autopsy report, which found that both bodies, in addition to the blunt wound to the head, also had numerous puncture wounds caused by a sharp object with a blade. Furthermore, according to the autopsy report, Sidney, Brian's father, was hit in the back of the head by the hammer while he was sitting, which disproves Brian's version of self-defense. Brian was detained and formally charged with the crime against his parents. During his time in prison, he was subjected to psychiatric tests that concluded that he has narcissistic personality disorder, something that largely explained his behavior. On June 29, 2005, Brian Blackwell was sentenced to life in prison for the crime against Sidney and Jacqueline Blackwell. At the time, the Guardian newspaper published a story saying that Brian could become eligible for parole after serving 5.5 years if a psychiatrist decided he was fit for release. However, the judge responsible for the case said that this would be very unlikely. During his time in jail, Brian wrote multiple letters to his girlfriend, requesting her presence for a visit. At first, Malcy refused to do it, but then she gave in and went to visit Brian. She would have questioned him about why he did that to his own parents. Brian couldn't explain. In 2016, 12 years after the crime, Brian was released on parole after the parole board declared that he was fit to return to society. Currently, his whereabouts are unknown, but some sources claim that he moved to a small town and adopted another name. And that was today's video. Thanks a lot for watching me until now, and see you in the next video.